great pleasure that I welcome Andre to come and talk to us. Andre is a postdoctoral fellow at the Sociology Department at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in Germany, and as he said, we've worked together in various capacities for many years. But at the moment, we're working on Landscapes of Democracy project, which has already started. It began in Germany a few weeks ago. Visited many key sites of democracy, past and present, Frankfurt and Berlin. And the second part of the project is now just beginning, because we are currently working with Norman and John and the refugee on learning about the interrelation of Western and political practices. And I guess what our commitment is with this project is not necessarily starting with the idea that Canada or Europe or the West is the centre of politics. But actually political centres are made, and they might be made in different ways. So today Ingo's going to talk about some of his own work that's been leading up to begin to encompass this Landscapes of Democracy project, covering on his PhD and a few other studies that he's involved in. And I guess he was very good and a discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and thanks, Michaela, for organizing this, and thank you to the Institute for hosting the event. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to the fieldwork in Millingimby, and it's been really wonderful to be in Darwin. And I'm here to learn. So in a way, it's a strange position to talk rather than to listen. I would be really curious to hear about all your projects and engagements. Maybe we can do that in the discussion or afterwards. Okay, so the central question of this talk is how can science and technology studies contribute to our understanding of democratic politics? And I'm trying to address this rather abstract question in 3 steps. The first step is going to be just a very quick introduction to STS through a key work called Laboratory Life, written by Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar in the late 1970s. And I will argue that, in a way, this was a work that aimed at politicizing science. The second step will be a quick summary of my PhD, which was an attempt to take this STS sensitivity, this politicization sensitivity, over to politics. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about that in relation to the Hungarian Parliament, which was my research site. And then the third step is my habilitation, which is a very strange German adventure. It's almost like a second PhD. Which will be, in a way, an inquiry into or an attempt to map the limits of democratic politics, where it breaks down, and what kinds of politics does it give rise to. This is, I have to say that this is very much work in progress, so my thoughts are quite fuzzy about it, so I hope that in the discussion you can help me just clarify some of the things, or point out some inconsistencies or areas that require further elaboration. And in the end of the presentation, I will argue that the situations that indicate the limits or the breakdowns of liberal democracy may allow us to politicize politics. That is, to rethink it in a way that avoids the false dichotomy of hope and despair. Again, this sounds very cryptic, but I hope that I can shed more light on it in the concluding section of the talk. Okay, so the first step is to talk a little bit about science and technology studies and how it can be understood as an attempt to politicize science. I will start with a quote from a book by David Livingstone titled "Putting Science in Its Place." The modern invention of the laboratory can be interpreted as a conscious effort to create a placeless place to do science, a universal site where the influence of locality is eliminated. Securing credibility and achieving objectivity required placelessness, and the triumph of the laboratory as the site par excellence of scientific plausibility since the middle of the 19th century bears witness to this prevailing conviction. So this, in a way, already addresses your question about laboratories. Laboratories are interesting because they are not supposed to be interesting. So for natural scientists, this is, or at least some versions of them, laboratories are the places where science is being done. But at the same time, these places don't supposed to matter when it comes to scientific publications. With that, I already almost summarized the main arguments of one of the foundational books of science and technology studies, Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar's Laboratory Life. And this is a book that was first published in the end of the 1970s, and it's based on the fieldwork of Bruno Latour in a very famous laboratory, the Salk Institute in California, in the mid-1970s. So in a way, he was being quite an iconoclast when he entered a laboratory as an anthropologist, so not as a natural scientist, to study scientists as if they belonged to a tribe or as if they had a specific culture. And the central motive of this, this is the picture of the laboratory, so it's quite an important place. Latour and Woolgar don't talk about this in the book, but the laboratory was designed by Louis Kahn and his associates. So this was a rather large prestige project in the 70s. So an incredible amount of money went into producing this, in a way, really fascinating and beautiful architecture. So in a way, a central motive of this anthropological undertaking was to treat the lab as a place and try to understand what is going on in there. And of course, if you enter a laboratory, what you see is mass. You see all kinds of things. You see machines, sometimes animals, mice, and other laboratory animals. You see humans. Some of them are wearing white coats, others aren't. And it's really a very strange amalgam of these human and non-human entities. So one of the things, or one of the striking findings of this anthropological undertaking that Latour and Woolgar were involved in was to speculate about all this mess. How is it that it's so prevalent, that it's really everywhere, and yet by the time it comes to the publication of scientific results, all this disappears? So here I have a couple of journals. So the laboratory that they were looking at was a laboratory in molecular biology, more specifically neuroendocrinology. And so here I just put on the slide some journals, famous journals in neuroendocrinology, just to indicate that by the time all that work is translated into the format of scientific publications, the mass that is involved in the making of these articles usually disappears. And one of the arguments, which in a way was generated quite a lot of controversy in the field, was that this purification process, so the disappearance of the mass, is instrumental. This is not because scientists are forgetful to mention, like they forgot to mention that there's a lot of mess, but this is instrumental to make things sound and look scientific. And what's more, all these instruments, devices, and other entities that go into the making of true representations of nature also continuously have to produce the nature that the representations are supposed to be about. So this is a complicated argument, but basically it suggests that laboratories are not only in the business of epistemology, that is knowing nature, but also ontology. So in a way of producing or solidifying a certain version of nature. STS scholars, including Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar, were then throughout the 1980s accused of being anti-science. A lot of natural scientists or historians and philosophers of science understood this move as an attempt to discredit science, but this was very far from their attempt or their purpose. What they were interested in is to somehow reintroduce science and scientific knowledge making to politics, or to open scientific knowledge making practices up for political scrutiny. So in a way, this is where I became interested in science and technology studies. This leads straight on to the second part of my talk, because in a way it's very interesting to evoke politics, but then why should we take politics for granted any more than we take science for granted? What would happen if we took this radical STS, so ethnographically informed STS sensitivity to the realm of politics? So these were the questions that, in a way, informed my PhD, which I did at the sociology department in Lancaster. And inspired by Latour and Woolgar's work, I also decided to focus on iconic sites. In my case, these were parliaments. And here you see a couple of images of parliaments, namely the Palace of Westminster in London, the Assemblée Nationale in Paris, the Reichstag in Berlin, and the Capitol in Washington. And just by looking at these grand buildings, one has the feeling that parliaments are very much unlike laboratories. They, in a way, celebrate placeness. But at the same time, in political theory, the importance of this place is also denied. So similar to the natural sciences and laboratories, parliaments as places in political theory are considered to be unimportant. So here's a quote from a political theorist called Claude Lefort, who says, "In a democracy, the locus of power becomes an empty place. There is no need to dwell on the details of the institutional apparatus. The important point is that this apparatus prevents governments from appropriating power for their own ends, from incorporating it into themselves." So in a way, this is not wrong, because parliaments are very different from palaces and other iconic sites of power. Just by storming a parliament, you don't immediately become powerful. But at the same time, to say that there is no need to dwell on the details of the institutional apparatus suggests that there is nothing interesting going on in there other than talk. Now, this was, in a way, the argument I decided to take issue with in my PhD. My field, or my site of research, was the Hungarian Parliament, which is in Budapest. And it was built in the late 19th century. At the time of the construction, it was the largest parliament building in the world. As far as I know today, it's the third largest after the parliaments in Argentina and Romania. So when it was built, Hungary was still part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, so it was a very different geopolitical setting. Late 19th century. So around the same time that Reichstag was built in Berlin, and in Australia, but I assume it was built much later. So basically, I decided to follow the STS research strategy and concentrate on all kinds of entities that populate this building, humans, but also machines, and also animals, because, well, this is just a footnote, but pigeons are a problem. And so the parliament keeps falcons to keep the pigeons away. So there are all kinds of enemies to parliamentary democracy, and pigeons shouldn't be underestimated. Anyway, so what I want to very, very quickly argue here is that if you take the parliament building as a point of departure for an empirical analysis of liberal democracy, then liberal democracy becomes an effect of a triple change in the logic of politics that happened sometime in the course of the 19th century. The first aspect of this change is an insistence on defining the political community as a nation or as a nation state. The second component of this is to deal with any problem this political community may have through legislation. And the third component is to establish a standard way of connecting issues, so issues that this political community faces through political representation. So as politicians became professional, what became important was not necessarily their upbringing or family connections, but their worldviews. And later on, these individual worldviews then kind of were clustered together into parties or major ideologies.
Do you think that applies in England? Where everyone's been to England? Is this a reaction to the monarchist or the feudal?
Exactly.
So becoming more democratic, I guess, instead of ruling power to money.
Exactly. And so just to illustrate these 3 points or these 3 moments of change in the logic of politics, I just want to show you 3 pictures. The first one is, this is the Holy Crown of Hungary. Hungary is no longer a monarchy, it's a republic. But the Holy Crown is the most important symbol of the state. The claim is that the state was founded in 1000. So in 2000, to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of the state, the Holy Crown was transported from the National Museum to the Parliament, and it's now on public display in the Cupola Hall. And although citizenship is defined in terms of rights and obligations, every Hungarian is also said to be a member of the Holy Crown. This is a very strange expression, but when you visit the Parliament and the Holy Crown, it is through this object you're supposed to feel that you belong. This is the second illustration. This is the House of Representatives in meeting. So this is where all the bills are being debated and then decided upon. And as I said earlier, a central fantasy of liberal democracy is that any problem and all problems can be dealt with through legislation. There is only one exception, and that is the annual budget. It has a separate procedure, but otherwise all the other issues need to be dealt with in a standardized way. And the third is about a professional politician. This is Péter Gusztos. He was my interlocutor as I was doing ethnographic fieldwork in the Hungarian Parliament between 2008 and 2010. He was a very young member of the Parliament, and I was following him around to understand what he does when he represents the interest of the people. And he was a member of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party in Hungary is slightly different from the one in Australia. In Hungary, this is more like a left-leaning party rather than a conservative party. And when he was running for a seat, it was his and his party's worldviews that were supposed to attract voters and bring them into the parliament.
Was it under a Liberal government at the time?
It was a liberal socialist coalition that then broke down as I was doing fieldwork. So that there was a slightly tense period, both for Peter and for me.
Mostly for you.
Well, at some point he asked me not to come because every time I showed up, something went horribly bad. So he thought I brought bad luck. Okay, so this is the triple transition in.
What happened to the election?
This is the triple transition that happened in the logic of politics in the 19th century, not only in Europe, but also in North America and I assume elsewhere in the world, although this is a very interesting question in itself. How far and how fast did these transitions take place? What is clear is that it was not quick and not linear, this transformation. If you just think of the revolutions of the 19th century and then the rise and the fall of totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, especially fascism and communism, Hungary had a fair share of that. But somehow, the prevalent thought in political theory in the early 21st century is that with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, liberal democracy has become a hegemonic model of governance. So, okay, not all countries are liberal democratic, but there is no external challenge to liberal democracy at the moment. So there's no real threat that any of the liberal democracies in Europe, North America, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia will be overtaken by another regime.
Even with the recent results in Austria, wasn't it 50-50?
With the presidential election.
Yeah, with the Nazis party.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting issue because in a way that still just proves that it's still a democracy, that anyone can be elected, and neo-Nazi parties and neo-Nazi or far-right candidates also want to win elections. That is the way they want to get into power. Okay, so this was the second part of the talk, and now comes the third. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I forgot to check, but okay. So does becoming a hegemonic model of governance mean that liberal democracy no longer faces any challenges? Not at all, I would say. But it just means that the challenges come from within rather than from without. So my habilitation in Frankfurt is an attempt to map some of these challenges. And mirroring this triple transition in the logic of politics in the late 19th century, it focuses on three instances that show how liberal democracy as a model of governance reaches its limits, and by doing so generates or may generate new forms of politics. So let me very briefly tell you about these three instances I've come across. And again, I just need to emphasize that this is work in progress, so it's really very sketchy, and I'm just going to highlight them very briefly. The first instance is a hunger strike that took place in Brussels in 2012. It involved 23 illegal immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East. And these illegal immigrants had left their home countries in the hope of a better future in Europe. They somehow managed to get to Europe. Excuse me. But because they had no papers, they couldn't get a work permit or a residency permit. And to draw attention to this impossible situation, at some point they decided to go on a hunger strike. I'm going to show you an image. This is quite a graphic image, so if you don't want to look at it, don't look at it. It shows one of the hunger strikers called Jamal, who's from Morocco. This is a Belgian newspaper article that, so the quote is that Europe was my best chance to live a good life. And it shows Jamal, who went into the hunger strike, also decided to have his lips sewn together to symbolize or to express their muteness in Belgium as a political entity. So they went on this hunger strike. It was it lasted for more than 100 days. So they were drinking tea and water, but they were not eating anything. So it's a very long hunger strike, and in a way, it was an unsuccessful hunger strike. They didn't get any of the things they wanted to get. They didn't get work permits. They didn't get residency permits. But before one would conclude that this was a completely futile undertaking, I would like to just suggest that throughout the hunger strike, as the hunger strikers' body was becoming weaker and weaker, they also experienced themselves as political beings. So in a way, they gained political agency, which, according to the logic of sovereignty, would not have been possible. So this is the first story I wanted to highlight. The second is about a group of social workers in Budapest who work with drug addicts in the most rundown part of the town. And for a long time they were operating a needle exchange point, seeing about 150 clients a day. But when the new Hungarian government came into power in 2010, one of the first things that they did is they passed a new law that regulated drug use very, very strictly. So it handles not only dealers as criminals, but also consumers. And they see needle exchange points and other harm reduction programs as ways of promoting drug use, and they actively discourage the operation of such needle exchange points in Budapest. So basically, in the 8th district, so in this really rundown part of town, the needle exchange point had to close down in 2014, and this group of social workers then decided to just concentrate on outreach programs. So do the needle exchange themselves, visit clients in their homes or at places where they shoot up, and exchange needles, but also offer HIV and hepatitis C screenings and other harm reduction programs. And so I would like to suggest that what they do is drug policy that works below or beyond legislation. What they do is not exactly illegal, but their aim is not to change the drug law either. Their aim is to make sure that the situation of drug users in this district doesn't get any worse. So this is the second story I wanted to highlight. And the third is much closer to you, I suppose. I don't know how many of you know Mark Guyula. In a way, the framing of this third story is that we are interested in indigenous politics, or more precisely, how indigenous politics is put in relation with liberal democracy. And on Sunday, Michaela and I are going to travel to Milingimbi, and one of the people we will talk to will be Mark Riula, who is running in the upcoming Northern Territory parliamentary election. We had many questions to ask from him, but one of the things that we are interested in is how he's able to negotiate the difference between the Northern Territory Parliament and the Yolngu Nations Assembly, which is the entity that officially endorses Mark in the upcoming election. So how he's able to negotiate the differences between these two parliaments without compromising any of them. And what is very fascinating about this case, without necessarily knowing much about it at the moment, at least I don't, is that this difference is very difficult to express in terms of worldviews. So I would suggest that these are not simply different views of the same world, but in a way we are dealing with different cosmologies. And liberal democracy is profoundly unready to deal with different cosmologies in and through their institutions. Okay, so these are the three cases I wanted to highlight, and obviously they are very different. But I would like to suggest that taken together they indicate not only important moments where liberal democracy reaches its limits, but also indicate interesting new forms of doing politics. So this is to say very quickly, these are forms that may help us to think about political agency beyond sovereignty, to think about policy beyond legislation, and to think about representation beyond worldviews. In contrast with hopeful political programs, these instances don't promise a great bright future. They all take rather bad situations as their points of departure. So refugee crisis in Europe, but I believe also in Australia is one of the most pressing problems. Drug use is and has been for a very long time not only a social problem, but also a source of moral anxiety, which is a very interesting question why that is. And indigenous politics is, especially in light of past injustices, an ongoing struggle. So it would be quite deceptive or unfair if we expected any hopeful or utopic promises associated with these instances. But at the same time, they don't advocate despair either. They insist on specific located differences between bad situations and worse. And I think that one of our tasks as scholars interested in places, peoples, and policies is to somehow develop a vocabulary that makes the politics of such instances expressible and articulable. Okay, so this is where I think I will stop. And I know that this was a lot to digest. I would be very happy to elaborate on any of the stories or any aspects further, either in the discussion, or if you want, you can just email me, or we'll be still here this afternoon and tomorrow. So I'm very happy to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you.